Hello, this is Nitrate Glow, and this is my audio commentary track for the 1926 Buster Keaton film Battling Butler. I'm not going to do too big or too fancy an introduction here. I'm just going to get right to the sync instructions. If you want, you can listen without the film, but if you want to watch with the film, I'm going to count down to three, and whenever I say, go, make sure that you're starting right when the MGM lion appears. That's where I start recording. So, okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, play. A fact that often confounds most modern Buster Keaton fans is that Battling Butler was his most successful film during the 1920s. It was more successful than The General or Sherlock Jr. or Steamboat Bill Jr. or all these films we tend to find much more creative, much more innovative. In comparison, Battling Butler seems much more modest. It seems much more safe. I don't think anybody would call it Buster Keaton's weakest film. A lot of people think The Three Ages or College fit that bill better. But it is common for people to kind of brush it aside, to think it's not on par with the great Keaton films of the period. Now, today I'm not going to argue that Battling Butler is secretly Buster's greatest film or his most original, but I do think it is his most underrated film, and I want to challenge the usual lukewarm reception it has received. I think so many people attribute Keaton's appeal wholly to his stunt work, his athletic prowess, the big set pieces in his movies. And by contrast, Battling Butler is a film of small, subtle pleasures, and I think its strengths become more apparent on rewatch. So here we have a very theatrical introduction to our hero Alfred Butler, complete with curtains framing the scene. Butler is perhaps the purest example of a type Keaton often played, the affable but useless rich guy. Keaton first took on this character type in the 1920 film The Saphead, a film in which he starred but did not direct, then returned to the idea in The Navigator in 1924. And a few of his MGM sound features used this character type, and some of his education shorts as well. And it's funny, there's something about Keaton's appearance and manner that make him well suited to playing these aristocratic chumps. It might be his cheekbones or the understated elegance of his movements. In her IMDb review of Battling Butler, critic and Keaton aficionado Imogen Sarah Smith also observes that the refined gentleman character suits Keaton's, quote, innate gentleness and quiet dignity, quote. Battling Butler wastes no time in establishing Alfred's main goal, that's to rough it and become more of an independent adult. And as it is imposed upon him from the outside by his father, Alfred approaches this goal with a less than appropriate attitude. He immediately asks his valet to arrange everything. The valet is played by Snitz Edwards. Now, if you've watched a lot of Hollywood movies from the 1920s, you have totally seen Snitz Edwards in something. He was one of the most prolific character actors of the period. Battling Butler represents his second time working with Keaton. The first was Seven Chances, and then they would appear together again in College in 1927. Born in Hungary as Edward Newman, Edwards immigrated to the U.S. when he was just a child. According to his granddaughter Laurel Humphreys Thurston, the name Snitz was reportedly an abbreviated form of his family nickname, Schnitzel. He was multilingual, with a good command of English, Hungarian, Yiddish, Spanish, and German. Edwards began his show business career on vaudeville, where he met his wife Eleanor Taylor. The two had 3 daughters together, and in the late 1920s, the family even appeared in a series of comedic two-reelers, so they were all very close. Edwards' career, like I said, was very prolific. He appeared in a lot of big films during the 1920s, like The Thief of Baghdad, The Phantom of the Opera. One of the weirder ones is The Cruise of the Jasper B, which is an odd proto screwball comedy that I would highly recommend if you enjoy super weird stuff. Some other films, The Mark of Zorro, Rosita, he was in quite a bit. Unfortunately, his career barely outlasted the American silent era, though it wasn't due to any, oh, his voice wasn't fitting for his image or he couldn't just adjust to the talkies. Edwards had a lot of health issues that just got worse the older he got. He suffered from arthritis, cirrhosis of the liver. So by the time he's in his final film, which is The Public Enemy with James Cagney, where he plays Putty Nose, most of his scenes could not be used due to those health issues. I do think you can see him briefly during one of the bar scenes, but don't quote me on that. During his last years, he was mostly bedridden. He had money troubles. He would ultimately pass away in 1937, much to the sorrow of the many film industry professionals who recalled him fondly as a very kind, very funny guy. Going back to the film, we now see that Alfred and the valet are out in nature. They are not exactly roughing it. He is doing what we would consider glamping by modern standards. He is not looking to actually live out in nature without any convenience at all. So right now, Alfred is looking for something to hunt because that is a thing manly men do. But of course, even surrounded by all this potential prey, he's not aggressive. He's not really looking to shoot anything. It's all very performative. And it's funny, but it's also endearing. It foreshadows what sets Alfred apart from the Battling Butler character we'll meet later in the film. Alfred hasn't a mean bone in his body, while Butler is going to be a total piece of work, more than willing to physically threaten anyone who displeases him. And here's the introduction to the leading lady of the piece, the mountain girl, played by Sally O'Neill. Around this period, Sally O'Neill was a star hopeful. She was only in her late teens, but she had appeared in some comedy two-reelers and as one of the three titular characters in MGM's Sally, Irene, and Mary. And no, she does not play Sally in that title. She plays Mary. She was not born Sally O'Neill. Her actual name was Virginia Noonan. The name Sally O'Neill was suggested by MGM, and this stuck for the rest of her career. So O'Neill appeared in quite a few films. Other notables from her filmography include D.W. Griffith's remake of his own The Battle of the Sexes, Warner Brothers' Talkie Showcase Show of Shows, where she performed a number with her sister Molly O'Day, and 1931's The Brat, which is a Pygmalion-style pre-code comedy directed by John Ford. I'm not a John Ford expert, but I suspect that film is like the worst he ever did. I do not recommend watching it. I only watched it as indirect research for this commentary, actually. While her New York Times obituary claimed O'Neill had a thin, unsuitable voice for the talkies, I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's just there were other performers who were much more popular than her, and she was always a relatively minor star in the great Hollywood constellation anyway. It drives me nuts because there's this assumption that any silent film star whose career fizzled out in the 1930s must have been a casualty of the talkies, but really oftentimes it was just changing tastes and audiences' apathy that did that. And regardless of the reason, O'Neill, she had a pretty solid movie career. It lasted until about 1937. And after that, she migrated to the stage, performed in the USO throughout the 40s and 50s, and she would ultimately die of pneumonia aged 59 in 1968. Though her New York Times obituary shaved off 4 years from that age in true show business fashion. All right, and as we can see on screen, Alfred is still having an incredibly hard time shooting anything. Of course, the irony is that in real life, Keaton was a very competent sportsman, and he loved hunting, he loved camping. Okay, now I think I should start talking about the actual play Battling Butler was based on. So, Battling Butler originated as a British stage musical featuring Jack Buchanan as both star and choreographer. And if you don't recognize that name, Buchanan is best known to classic film buffs as the campy director Jeffrey Cordova in The Bandwagon. So, Battling Butler was a musical. It opened in London during the 1922 holiday season, and it ran for 238 performances. It quickly gained the attention of Broadway producers across the Atlantic, and by 1923, it was Americanized as The Dancing Honeymoon. This modified version opened in Detroit during the summer, but by the time the show went to Broadway later that year, it was retitled Battling Butler. The Broadway version had Charlie Ruggles in the lead role, and it would run for about 313 performances, closing in 1924. So the plot of the show is quite different from the Keaton film. I mean, it's the same basic premise, but it's a lot lighter, a bit more openly farcical. In the play, Alfred is the one who comes up with the whole charade about being Battling Butler. He realizes when going through the newspaper that he happens to strongly resemble the boxing champion, and he claims to be one and the same person to his wife. He leaves home to go have some fun and games in the city, but he tells his wife, "Oh, I'm actually going out there to train for my next match." And of course, shenanigans ensue when his wife follows him to watch him train, and when Battling Butler himself finds out about the deception. And in order to get back at Alfred, he offers to let him fight in the ring in his stead. So the character in the show is a lot less sympathetic than the one Keaton plays in the film. He initiates the deception himself, and he does it just for egotistical purposes. He does it to make himself look good. And obviously, the show appears to have just been very light and very frothy. Famously, it ends with Alfred not even having to fight in the ring, which, as anyone who has seen the film version knows, Keaton did not want to do that. He felt such a thing would be a narrative cheat, and that the narrative should build to something dramatic. Keaton was not about keeping things too light or too frothy. He liked having actual stakes in the story. And now we have Alfred coming out in his nice suit, and the mountain girl appears to like what she sees. It's interesting. A lot of Keaton films involve the love interest demanding Keaton step up, that his character become more active or more manly or adhere to certain social codes in order to win her over. And the mountain girl isn't like that at all. She appears to love Alfred from the get-go. She doesn't care that he's not this big macho man. She likes his refinement and his gentleness. And right now, looking at her father and her brother, you get the sense that she's never quite met a man like Alfred. She doesn't really want him to be this big, assertive, aggressive, macho guy. She likes him as he is. And ultimately, Alfred's journey is not going to involve becoming, the stereotypical macho guy. He just needs to have a bit more of a backbone. He just needs to be able to stand on his own 2 feet, because otherwise, he is fine as he is, and she does love him as he is. Now, the mountain girl's father was played by Walter James, and he was another prominent character actor of the period. The year before this, he played quite a different fatherly role as Mary Pickford's warm-hearted but ill-fated police officer father in Little Annie Rooney. And then a year after this, he was Harold Lloyd's burly sheriff father in The Kid Brother. And he worked steadily into the sound era, though over time his parts had a tendency to become uncredited. He died in 1946. The Mountain Girl's brother is played by Bud Fine, a World War I veteran who broke into movies in 1924. He had a long, if undistinguished, movie career, appearing in over 100 productions until 1956. Funny enough, as of this date, both actors have images from Battling Butler as their profile pics on their respective Wikipedia articles. This gag with the table leg is so cute. People often talk about Keaton as though he's this cynical, cold filmmaker, but gags like this are so sweet and good-natured, and it really shows how these two are falling for each other, and they're just so absorbed with one another. This isn't kind of the sour view of romance you get in something like College. The leading ladies in Keaton's films have famously been described as breathing props, and in one interview, Keaton even said, "Oh, the leading lady is never really that important." But this really does not bear out if you pay any attention to the films at all. Some are less interesting than others, that's for sure. I don't think anybody remembers the leading lady of Seven Chances, Ruth Dwyer, with any particular appreciation. She is mostly there just to be the romantic prize at the end of the film. But you really cannot say that about, say, Catherine Maguire in The Navigator or Sherlock Jr., who is every bit as much a comic partner as she is some romantic ideal. Or Marion Mack in The General, or my favorite, Dorothy Sebastian in Spite Marriage. You know, these are characters who act as comic partners to Keaton. And Sally O'Neill in this film isn't quite that, but she is an important character. She helps facilitate Alfred's growth into somebody more independent, into somebody with agency who doesn't need Snitz Edwards to arrange everything for him. On a brief side note, I've always wondered if the Mountain Girl was named after the Constance Talmadge character in D.W. Griffith's Intolerance. Keaton has quite a few Griffith references in a few of his films. I mean, most famously, The Three Ages was said to be a kind of riff on the structure of Intolerance, you know, skipping between different time periods. And in Go West, the cow is named Brown Eyes, which is the name of one of the characters in the Huguenot plot in Intolerance. And also, Constance Talmadge at the time was Keaton's sister-in-law, and I think the two of them got on fairly well. I think she was just about the only one of his in-laws he did get on with, because they were both very playful and mischievous. Oh, and by the way, some people like psychoanalyzing these films, and anytime Keaton's characters have strained relations with potential in-laws or actual in-laws, you always have some viewers who feel it is a commentary on his relationship with, you know, Peg Talmadge and Norma Talmadge and all of that. And I just have to say, conflict with in-laws in comedy, it's a very standard convention. I am not one of those people who thinks these films are coded psychodramas about Keaton's own life. So never fear, I am not going into any of that at all. Now, just a few seconds ago, we got our first glimpse of Battling Butler, the villainous boxer played by Francis McDormand. And it's so amusing. The valet is like, "He's taking your name, sir." And then Alfred's like, "Arrange to stop it," which is, of course, ironic, because in truth, it's Alfred who will be taking Battling Butler's name in order to impress his potential in-laws. Now, Alfred being Alfred, he is going to be consistent with his general modus operandi, which is to have the valet arrange absolutely everything in his life, including his desire to marry the mountain girl. He's not going to go out and propose himself. He is just going to send the valet to do it. I suspect if he was alive now, he would probably just text the mountain girl his marriage proposal. And of course, consistent as well, the valet is going to be the one to set up the whole charade that Alfred Butler is indeed one and the same with Battling Butler, and that he's actually a totally badass boxing champion and not a guy who has his valet do everything and who likes glamping in the woods. Though, of course, Alfred isn't doing this because he's lazy or anything like that. He just has lived such a coddled existence, he doesn't know of any other way to approach wooing a woman. With the valet's sudden proposal that Alfred is actually a boxer, Battling Butler officially enters farce territory. Now, Buster Keaton was not a fan of farce. He famously said, "Life is too serious for farce comedy." He often felt farce was annoying because these stories could often be cleared up if everyone just sat down, stopped screaming, and talked straight for a minute. Now, regardless, his brother-in-law and producer Skank, Joseph Skank, bought the rights to two stage farces for Keaton during the silent era. First of these was Seven Chances, and then, there's this, Battling Butler. And then, of course, if you're familiar with Keaton's MGM talkies in the 1930s, a lot of them were either based on stage farces or they used their conventions. And when he had more creative freedom in the 20s, Keaton was better able to infuse these farces with his own sensibilities. Seven Chances famously has the very Keaton-esque finish with the chase of the bride mob and the rock slide in the country. Battling Butler doesn't have the same kind of major set piece, but it's interesting how the farce is a bit toned down, or at the least, its presentation is not in that usual hectic madcap manner. Now, when I think of the kind of farce Keaton hated, my mind just imagines people screaming, slamming doors, shrieking, kind of like what you get in Free and Easy or Parlor, Bedroom, and Bath. Here, the farce is much less frantic, and also the possible emotional toll of Alfred's lying, of his deception. It's constantly kept to the forefront. He knows if his deception is unveiled, there is a good chance the mountain girl will leave him. And because he genuinely loves her, he even considers letting the charade go and giving her up. Now, as I've said before, the mountain girl is not a character who needs to be wooed or won. She's pretty much attracted to Alfred from the start. This isn't like Annabelle Lee telling Johnny Gray he needs to go enlist in the army, or Mary in college telling Ronald that he needs to be a jock or he can take a hike. The mountain girl loves Alfred as he is. The actual entity that needs to be wooed and won is the community around Mary. Not Mary, I'm sorry, the mountain girl. Basically her family, her community. They need to be wooed and won because without their approval, the chances of these two marrying is slim to none. Alfred and the Mountain Girl are not rebels. They're going to play by society's rules, no matter how arbitrary they might seem. And this brings me to a really interesting analysis of Keaton's style and themes. There's a good analytical film book. It's called The Material Ghost by Gilberto Perez. And he's got a wonderful chapter about Buster Keaton in that book. In a passage primarily discussing college, Perez observes that Keaton's characters are often desperate to prove themselves worthy of the greater community at large. His desire is about more than just getting the girl or being traditionally successful because he personally wants it. For Keaton's characters, they don't want to be alone. They want to be part of the community, even if it means playing social games that otherwise hold no meaning and make no sense. In the general, Johnny doesn't really care about being a soldier. When they announce the Civil War has started, he doesn't get up, he doesn't do anything until Annabelle tells him to go do so. In Steamboat Bill Jr., Willie wants to connect with his father, and he does what he does in order to impress his father. For Keaton's characters, the end goal is almost always joining a greater community, whether that be through a romantic union or impressing a parental figure or, by being BFFs with a cow, as in Go West. And this lends an innate sense of pathos to Keaton's characters. As Perez says, if Keaton seems to be the loneliest of the silent comics, it's because he's the one to whom companionship matters most. And it's the same in Battling Butler. He only ever went on this camping trip to make his dad happy, and now he's only going to agree to his valet's insane scheme because he wants to be with the mountain girl. And he has to live up to the standards of her community in order to make that marriage happen. One of the great ironies of the charade, though, is that it really keeps Alfred and the Mountain Girl apart. It prevents them from being together, and when they do get married, they have just about the shortest wedding ceremony ever. And, obviously the movie doesn't go too much into it. It's also implied that obviously they have not consummated the marriage. They're not enjoying any kind of honeymoon bliss because he's too busy upholding this entire masquerade that he's a boxer. So that's another thing. He's using these deceptive means to win the mountain girl's, or at least her family's approval, but it's keeping the two apart. Oh, and here we have Buster Keaton's truest love of all, trains. I think Sally O'Neill is just absolutely adorable. One thing I forgot to mention earlier, before she got into films, she did have a vaudeville career, and her stage name was Chootsie Noonan, or Chotzi Noonan, I forgot which. And then when she was working with Hal Roach in film, her stage name was Bugs O'Neill. She actually went through quite a large amount of stage names. Sally O'Neill is the one that ultimately stuck. Now we get to see Battling Butler in the flesh, played by Frances McDormand. Now, McDonald had a pretty long film career up to this point. He got started in the industry in 1913. He worked with former Biograph star Marion Leonard's company, and he made his movie debut playing Don Jose to Leonard's Carmen. He worked steadily through the 1910s, and by the early 20s, he had a certain unwanted reputation as, quote, the prettiest man in Hollywood. This did not please MacDonald. In a 1940 interview, he claimed this occurred after he had appeared in a film with Clara Bow. Now, he didn't name this film in the interview, but it had to have been My Lady of Whims from 1925, a movie best remembered for a scene in which Bow wore a scandalous skin-tight dress. In that film, MacDonald played a bohemian Greenwich Village artist out to have Beau for himself, and apparently he was very pretty while doing it. Now, this mortified his sense of masculinity, so MacDonald went out of his way to secure villainous roles of a less refined sort. So the Battling Butler part is, a step in this persona transformation. He was particularly proud of playing a gangster in von Sternberg's 1928 film The Dragnet, though he misremembered this film as the far more celebrated Underworld. He continued to appear in films and television until the late 1960s and became a staple of Cecil B. DeMille's movies. His final role would be as a Russian in Blake Edwards' mammoth tribute to silent comedy The Great Race. He would die in 1968. So I was busy yapping while this was going on, but Butler's manager and trainer are getting particularly the trainer, are getting very agitated during the match, pummeling poor Alfred as a result. And I just love this illustration of how ill at ease the very refined, gentle Alfred is, even in the crowd at a boxing match, and he's not even in the ring yet. Oh man, and I love Keaton's traumatized reactions, his little defensive postures as he's afraid he's going to get pummeled again in the trainer's next bout of enthusiasm. It has always killed me how people over the years have considered Keaton's persona emotionless, frozen face, stone face. And it's like he's anything but emotionless here. It's just he's too polite to let it all hang out, more or less. He tries to keep himself controlled. Though, as here, his terror is quite evident. Keaton was a brilliant actor. He was a very expressive actor. He just never overdid it. And then here we have the mountain girl and family listening to the match over the radio. This is definitely the kind of story where modern technology would make a lot of the farce impossible. Obviously, they would just stream it now or watch it on their phones. And then, of course, Alfred and the valet are isolated in the frame, the last remaining attendees at this match. And it becomes very clear that this is going to be a much harder deception to pull off than either of them anticipated. Now, of course, the valet thinks the mountain girl and her family are dumb hicks and that they'll be easily fooled by anything, but Alfred is definitely not so confident. Just a note I didn't mention before, but this auditorium is not a set. It was the actual Olympic Auditorium that had just opened in downtown Los Angeles. According to silent film historian John Bankston, this may in fact be the stadium's debut appearance on film. It later appeared in a Three Stooges short as well. I love how this scene ends on a wonderful visual metaphor with the lights going out. These two have been left totally in the dark, unsure exactly how they are going to pull this off. Now, Keaton looks very sporty in this little outfit right here. It isn't common to think of Buster Keaton as a clothes horse, but in this film he was outfitted in a variety of different get-ups, according to the Press Tribune. His costume closet included over 40 suits, a dozen pair of shoes, and a myriad of accessories like hats, spats, scarves, and ties. In the usual dry, humble Keaton manner, he described much of the expensive, stylish outfits he wore as quote-unquote junk. Apparently, he needed an on-set valet of his own to get dressed in all that finery. This is one of the great awkward scenes of this movie. So, one of the complications in Alfred's scheme is that Battling Butler is on the train as they stop in the mountain girl's hometown. The locals are celebrating Alfred as he disembarks the train, while the real butler looks on perplexed and more than likely with a bruised ego. As we'll come to discover, he is not the kind to shake off the littlest slight, even if it's not intended to harm him. Now, this entire scene is incredibly uncomfortable, and the audience for Alfred's potential failure has much expanded in scope, with the whole town now thinking he is a badass fighter. These scenes in the mountain girl's hometown were shot in Kernville, a small community in California established in 1848. And the little parade here is marching to the Mountain House Inn, a real hotel where Keaton and crew actually stayed during shooting. I love how this triumphant procession for Keaton, Alfred is reacting like this is the march to his execution almost. It's just making him sweat. And once again, the whole idea of Keaton as emotionless, it just does not hold up here. Yes, his face is neutral, but you can tell from his stiff body language that he is terrified. He knows he is not going to be able to pull this stuff off long term. He is in enemy territory, and he is the only one that knows it. One of the joys of this film and a lot of other silent films is when they do shoot on real locations, and it has a time capsule quality, like you're getting to see these places that more often than not, no longer exist or have changed so much. As of this recording, this film is 99 years old, so it's really like stepping back in time. It's one of the things I love most about these older films. And now that the march has ended, it is time for what is one of the most awkward, uncomfortable weddings in cinematic history to this point. Poor Alfred, this was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. I don't even think he was aware that the marriage ceremony was going to be a thing. He seems surprised to see the mountain girl in her wedding getup. Now, I love how cramped the shots get. We have all these figures crowding the frame. The house is a little bit stuffy looking. It has a very claustrophobic feel without going too over the top. So we also inherently feel Alfred's sense of entrapment, his mounting terror of the situation through the mise en scène. And of course, the fact that it feels so cramped, that there's so many people shoved into the frame, this once again emphasizes that this is about more than just winning over one woman. It's communal. As I mentioned earlier, this whole scheme really prevents Alfred and the Mountain Girl from being together. And even here, after they've exchanged their wedding vows, after they are officially made husband and wife, she still is being pulled aside by her family members, by everybody else in the room. There is no real satisfaction to be found here. And then, of course, just a few seconds after they get married, he is pulled back into having to keep up the charade that he is a boxer. Also, I find it really hilarious that the writer of this newspaper article is credited as Demon Onion. Like, that reads like somebody's social media handle, and I'm not sure, maybe this is like a 1920s specific joke that I just don't understand from a 21st century perspective. It is pretty funny. If that is the case, I mean, that's just the nature of time. Certain jokes that are obvious and natural to a contemporary audience may not, it may be lost when you watch the same movie 99 years later. And now Alfred himself must make sure that Mary does not follow him while he trains. And this inner title is funny, where he's like, "Oh, I'm such a bloodthirsty, brutal beast in the ring. I don't want you to see me like that." And on one hand, yes, it is very funny, because if Alfred is anything, brutal and bloodthirsty, ain't it? But later in the film, we'll come to find out he does have a bit more fight in him than I think anybody, including himself, expected. Now, over the years, People have been confounded by claims that Battling Butler was Buster Keaton's personal favorite of his feature film work. And that is insane to most people. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is considered a very minor film in the Keaton canon, with some even dismissing it outright. And I this is pretty consistent with some of Keaton's statements about the quality of his own work. I think some of his judgments are not necessarily judgments fans or scholars would share. Like, he once claimed his favorite of his short films was Hard Luck, a two-reeler most fans would probably agree is more mid than anything else. But he felt so powerfully about it because the ending of the film got one of the biggest audience reactions of his entire career. I think he liked the fact that it had such a huge laugh. And, even like his negative assessments of certain films, like he wasn't fond of Seven Chances or Go West, both of which are fondly regarded by most fans. But I've always been a bit skeptical with the idea that Battling Butler was his favorite film, because there are also interviews in which the general is listed as his personal favorite of his films. And he often called that one, oh, that one was one of my pets. I think he was very proud of the general more than anything else he had ever done. But he probably was very proud of Battling Butler. It may have been because of the fight scenes, his training for it, but I think he also enjoyed how successful it was, that it was so popular with the audiences of the time. Keaton really did like pleasing the crowd. He really did. He would cut gags from movies if he thought the audience really wasn't enjoying them. Most famously in The Navigator, the gag where he directs a school of fish, he cut it when the preview audiences didn't take to it. So Keaton, I think he did judge, the quality of at least his own films in the 20s based on audience reaction. He certainly didn't feel that way with his MGM talkies, where Sidewalks of New York was the most popular one. He thought it was just awful. One other thing I should mention about Keaton's feelings on Battling Butler is that this was the first of his feature films he showed to his third and final wife, Eleanor Norris, while they were dating. And considering how often he appears shirtless in the second half of this film and how very fit he was, I'd say that was a shrewd move. Just some moments ago, we got our introduction to Mrs. Battling Butler, played by Mary Bryan. Now, Bryan is not among the most iconic silent film performers, but in the 20s she enjoyed a fair amount of success. Her first big film was the 1924 Peter Pan, in which she played Wendy Darling to Betty Bronson's Peter Pan. She was noticed after appearing in a beauty contest, and that's how she got the Wendy role. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, she worked steadily. And in fact, after a contract with Paramount lapsed in 1932, she worked freelance. In her personal life, she was linked to a few leading men of the day, most notably Cary Grant. Once the U.S. entered World War II, she traveled with the USO to entertain the troops abroad. Apparently, while traveling, she was even caught up in the Battle of the Bulge. Following the war, her movie career wound down, ending in 1947. She continued to act on stage and television in the 1950s, and she was married to film editor George Tomasini, who famously worked on Hitchcock's Rear Window and Psycho. She lived a long time, dying in 2002. Now, with the introduction of Mrs. Butler, the film flirts with some pretty scandalous territory. Now, Battling Butler assumes that his wife is having an affair with Alfred. And considering how flirty she is, I think it can be assumed that perhaps she has had infidelities in the past. And from what we see of this relationship, it is pretty toxic, to say the least. There is an implication that the relationship is marked with even domestic physical violence as well. And that's some pretty dark territory for what is mostly a very light, farcical film. I'm not sure if that angle was present in the original stage show, but considering how much Keaton, and he injects a lot more emotional stakes into the story, I think that may have been an invention of this film, but don't take my word for it. It is funny though that Mary Bryan is playing this character. At the time, fan magazines described her as the sweetest girl in pictures, and Mrs. Butler is clearly not that. I mean, obviously, clearly not deserving of abuse from her husband or anything like that, but she's a bit more of a very flirty, naughty character, not exactly what you would call sweet in any traditional sense. So I imagine just like Frances McDonald, this was a departure for her as well. One bit of lesser known trivia about this film is that Buster Keaton considered remaking it as a talkie in the 1940s. It was around the time he made Boom in the Moon in Mexico, which is notable as the last time he had a starring role in a feature film production. And he was considering remaking Battling Butler over there, and apparently he even wrote a screenplay treatment, excerpts of which you can access on the Kino Lorber release of the film on Blu-ray. And it appears, from what I've read of those excerpts, it seems to have been very close to what, this film is. Keaton was not a believer in overly talky talkies. He often said if he had been able to make sound films his own way, he really would not have been all about verbal banter. He said, I would have pretty much just did what I always did. And of course, that's one of the great unknowns, one of the great what ifs of film history. What if Buster Keaton hadn't lost control of his career? And what if he had been able to make sound films his own way? Because he wasn't against the talkies. He didn't have the same reluctance as someone like Charlie Chaplin. Keaton was a bit of a technophile. He was fascinated by these new technologies. When television came along, Keaton was like an early advocate of the technology. He loved it. So I kind of wonder what a Battling Butler remake would have been like. It obviously would have been much more low budget than this if it had the same resources behind it as Boom in the Moon. But at least it would have had a stronger narrative base than Boom in the Moon, for sure. Now we have Alfred pretending to train now that he has seen the mountain girl unexpectedly appearing at the training site. His way of doing so is to put a sweatshirt on. And I love how this obscures the fact that Keaton was very muscular and toned. The moment he takes off his shirt in this movie, in fact, the moment he even just wears that tank top, it's like the gig is up as far as suspension of disbelief goes. He was very, very fit. It's a problem college, the film college also has. He's supposed to be a total weakling, but it's clear in that film, Ronald, at least he got fit. Lifting textbooks, I guess, though I don't know how you could explain Alfred's muscles at all. One of Keaton's points of pride in the production of Battling Butler is that he actually did adhere to a proper boxing training regimen. So he hired actual boxing trainers to show him the ropes, and he adhered to a strict diet, swearing off sweets, coffee, and cigarettes. The October 9th, 1926 issue of the Burlington Gazette described Keaton's Battling Butler regimen as follows. Quote, the actor-fighter accumulated a flock of black eyes in rapid succession. What with a yearning for lady nicotine, deep apple pies, and slabs of Swiss cheese, Buster says he became a nervous wreck. But he stuck to his diet, finished the picture like a real pugilist. Forgive me if I pronounce that wrong. And then broke the training with a bang. Yeah, as we know, Buster did love his cigarettes, as unfortunately that's what ultimately killed him in 1966. But yeah, he was very strict about adhering to this regimen. And I think Keaton he had such a great sense of integrity. He liked doing things for real, doing his own stunts, impressing the audience, or even in the general where he wanted to make it, quote, so authentic it hurt in a historical sense. With the end of this sequence, we're about to get to, once again, the darker, more suggestive subplot about Alfred's supposed infidelity with Mrs. Butler. And as farcical as this situation is, the whole infidelity thing, it's one of the building blocks of much of stage farce. There is quite a dark, sinister undertone to it. I mean, Butler, he gives her a black eye. He is a domestic abuser. It's yet another reason why we should be afraid for Alfred and afraid for the other characters. This is a dangerous guy. And this kind of ties into comments Martin Scorsese has made about Battling Butler over the years. So you may have seen this interview when discussing his own boxing film Raging Bull. Martin Scorsese famously said that Buster Keaton was one of the few people who had the right attitude towards boxing in the movies. And now, when you think of a dramatic film like Raging Bull and a comedy like Battling Butler, those two films really couldn't seem more different. Even down to the way the boxing scenes are shot. In Battling Butler, they're relatively brief, they're filmed in long shot, whereas if you watch Raging Bull, the camera is up close, the audience is very intimate with the action. Some of those scenes are very painful to watch. And of course, the protagonists of each film are absolutely nothing alike. Alfred is a total sweetheart, he's gentle and clueless. And Jake LaMotta is an absolute monster. He is a monster in the ring, and he's a monster to everybody in his life. However, the attitude the two films have toward boxing as a sport are very similar. So there is this unstated but persistent distaste of the savage spectacle of boxing, and the boxers in each film, Jake LaMotta and Battling Butler himself, are bullying, insecure men who lash out at any perceived slight through violence. In fact, both LaMotta and Butler are insecure about their wives cheating on them, and in both cases they resort to domestic abuse to keep them under control. There's a vein of misogyny in their behavior. So I think that's the meaning behind Scorsese's comments. I used to think they were very strange, but when you think about it like that, they make sense. I've always obviously paid more attention to the reveal of the black eye in this scene, but the cuffs and collar on that outfit are quite something. This scene in which the two Mrs. Butlers both appear and fight over who's who, I think this was also in the original stage show, and yeah, that's not surprising. It is, once again, prime farce material, the mistaken identity, the misunderstandings. And the timing here is just sublime. I love how Sally O'Neill's resentment slowly builds, and then Mary Bryan is just absolutely clueless. She's like, "Oh, you want some? See, you're admiring my candies." It's really, really great. And once again, it doesn't go to shrill heights, it doesn't go too over the top. I feel like this scene, if it was in one of Keaton's MGM talkies, they would have just made it absolutely unbearable. Like, I still get PTSD from some of the shouting and screaming that you have to hear in Free and Easy. Keaton, I feel like he had a lot more restraint when it came to farcical situations like this. Now, once again, Alfred is in a total sinkhole, or he's deeper in the sinkhole, I suppose you could say, because now he has further been brought to the attention of Battling Butler, who is now realizing just what Alfred is up to. So for the moment, it appears as though Alfred is being given a helping hand from Battling Butler. For the moment, he's allowing him to save face in front of the mountain girl. But as we know from all the behavior we've seen from Mr. Butler, this is not what it seems. And Alfred is so guileless that he doesn't seem to detect the malice beneath this character's apparent helpfulness. And as a narrative complication, this is just genius, because Mr. Butler is not happy with someone else taking his name and potentially messing around with his wife. So once again, any hope Alfred has of escaping this bad situation, the door after door is being slammed in his face. This is no longer some kind of light, airy farce. It's slowly becoming more nightmarish. It's a bit like the same strategy in Our Hospitality, where Keaton plays a character who is safe so long as he stays in the home of his would-be killers. They're too sophisticated. They're too dedicated to the idea of Southern hospitality to kill him inside their own home. And I think the same blend of suspense and humor applies here. The stakes just keep growing as the film goes. There is a very real chance Alfred may even be killed, either in the ring or by Butler in a bout of rage. Now, the trainer and the manager will be left behind to deal with this horrible situation as best they can. For Butler, it's a point of pride, but for them, it's like this is their career. They really can't risk it on such pettiness, but they have to make do with the best they've got. And it's clear from the manager and the trainer sizing up of Alfred that they are not too impressed by what they see. Here we get some classic Keaton framing and blocking. The manager dominates the center of the frame, and then he moves aside, and we see Alfred in all his allegedly puny weakling glory, with his toned muscular arms and thighs. As always, I also just continue to absolutely adore Snitz Edwards. I love the little mannerisms he brings to this character, especially when he starts licking his thumb while trying to put on the boxing glove. One of my favorite things about the valet character is the sense that he just thinks he is way too good for all of this. You know, this whole charade, these people Keaton wants to marry into. He's just too good for it, but he's too much of a professional to slack. Oh, and I love Alfred's very delicate appraisal of how the glove looks on his hand. Keaton once claimed that you can't be considered a genius in slap shoes and a flat hat, and this sequence coming up is about to prove that absolutely wrong. All of these scenes in the ring where Alfred is trying to train are just sheer freaking physical comedy genius. The way this man gets himself all tangled up in this net, the way he does all this crap without breaking his neck and seeming to come out unscathed is just, it has never failed to astonish me. Stuntman Harvey Perry once said, "You really cannot double for a guy like Keaton because even his falls are just so distinct. They're so unique." Not that Keaton has ever been in any particular danger of being obscure since his rediscovery in the 50s and 60s, but I think part of the reason Keaton, a lot of clips and gift sets of him go viral pretty easily, and I think it is because he's doing all this stuff for real. There's no trickery. You know, he's doing this real physical thing, and I think in the age of CG trickery and deep fakes, there's just something so impressive about that. In this section coming up, in which Alfred's opponent in the ring is going to start hitting him, and it's like he has so little fight in him that it doesn't even occur to him to fight back, and he's just running in circles. Like, I don't know, just there's even a weird athleticism and grace, even in that. Like, just watching Keaton move. I know I just sound like I'm rambling. It's just it's hard to analyze why something is funny. It kind of takes the humor away from it. But I do like how these gags, they illustrate character. They are a part of the narrative. It's not just a series of disconnected, funny moments. Keaton really did have such a great command of drama. He had a keen intuition about what would be satisfying to an audience. You know, he never wanted to cheat the audience out of like dramatic satisfaction. And I think that is the clearest in Battling Butler out of all his films, particularly when we get to that climactic scene. In interviews, Keaton seemed to be proudest of the way he and his team changed the ending of Battling Butler. For them, it's not satisfying if Alfred just remains timid the entire time, if there's no growth there. And in interviews, he often talked about how proud he was of this innovation. For example, in 1958, he was speaking with George C. Pratt, and Keaton had this to say about Battling Butler, and particularly how they changed the ending. Quote, Battling Butler I liked. It was a good picture. I told the original story that was taken from the stage show, except that I had to add my own finish. I couldn't have done the finish that was in the show. He just finds out in the dressing room up at Madison Square Garden that he doesn't have to fight the champion, and he promises the girl he'll never fight again. And of course the girl don't know but what he did fight. But we knew better than to do that to a motion picture audience. We couldn't promise him for 7 reels that I was going to fight in the ring and then not fight. We knew that we had to fight. So we staged a fight in the dressing room with the guy who just won the title in the ring, by having bad blood between the fighter and myself, and it worked out well. End quote. Yes, and by the way, I'm sorry, but I am not going to try to imitate Keaton's distinctive Midwestern accent. I am not a skilled actor. I can barely even talk in these commentaries without stuttering over myself. So I've saved you that. Going back to the film, I love this right here where Alfred starts swatting at his opponent in the ring, almost like he's taking the training way too personally. It's very funny, and it shows that he is not as placid as he seems, or as he has seemed throughout this film. And it gives us our first little inklings of the aggression he's going to show whenever Butler pushes him way too far. I like how Keaton plants that earlier on here. At the very least, now Alfred has gone from trying to avoid fighting to actually trying to do it correctly, though obviously he hasn't the timing. Quite opposite of the real Buster Keaton, as always. It takes a really special sense of timing to pretend that you don't have any. I'll talk a bit about Tom Wilson, who plays Butler's trainer here. He had a very long career. It went about from the 1910s up until the early 60s when he was in his 80s. He mostly appeared in character roles or small parts. One of his early credits is The Birth of a Nation, where he's one of the servants of Stoneman. And he also appeared as the kindly police officer who helps Mae Marsh in Intolerance. And he appeared in several Chaplin shorts like Shoulder Arms, Sunny Side. He appeared in The Kid. This was just one of many, many small parts he took over time. He became less and less likely to be credited once the talkies hit, but he did work steadily up until he died. The valet would probably be a pretty good boxer. He seems to have all that aggression and willingness to take somebody down that Alfred lacked. It wasn't until rewatching this movie a fair bit for this commentary that I really just appreciated Snitz Edwards' performance. I once heard somebody say they felt the supporting roles in a lot of Buster Keaton's films were not terribly distinctive, but I think Snitz Edwards here, I think that's definitely not true. He is indeed a very memorable character. While the humor and physicality of this sequence is excellent, it is also a bit hard to watch. Keaton so aptly plays fatigue. Like he's clearly tired and exhausted and discouraged by this whole ordeal. In her IMDb review of this film, Imogen Smith brings up that he's reacting the way any soft-bellied human would to being pummeled. I mean, if you stuck me in this training ring, I would react just about the same way. It's very realistic. Alfred deploying some nice strategy to the question of entering the ring without getting tangled up in the net. This is yet another scene where you should definitely just bask in the wonder of Snitz Edwards. I love how angry he gets, and I feel like this man would be willing to commit like cold-blooded murder just to help Alfred out. He really should have gotten his own movie. I just love this guy. Once again, I'd like to urge you to try out Cruise of the Jasper Bee if you enjoy seeing Snitz Edwards be nasty and just evil, actually. In that one, he's the villain. And that film does have a few other Buster Keaton connections. It was directed by James W. Horn, who directed College, and the plot is even very similar to Seven Chances, where a young man has to get married on his 25th birthday or else he won't inherit a fortune. Oh man, and of course, me being me, I just talked through one of my favorite compositions in the whole film. The two parallel cuts where we see Buster's face through the trainer's arm and then his wife on the other side. It's very beautiful, very elegant. It reminds me a lot of a similar shot in The General where Buster's hiding under the table and there's a hole made by the cigarette or the cigar in the tablecloth, and he looks through it and he sees the face of Annabelle Lee. And poor Alfred is done for the day. He is heading out. This moment with Buster collapsing onto the massage table is a particularly popular scene on Tumblr. If you've ever interacted with the Buster Keaton fan base on Tumblr, this is a much gift scene, probably for reasons you can easily imagine. Reactions to Battling Butler have fluctuated over time. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1920s, this was Buster Keaton's most popular silent film. It was the most lucrative. Audiences loved it. The critics certainly loved it a lot more than they did something like The General or Sherlock Jr., films that are considered absolute masterpieces of the silent era now. Um, Over time, its esteem has dipped a little bit. Not that anybody thinks it's outright bad, but it isn't uncommon for people to talk about how conventional they think it is. If you read James Curtis's biography of Buster Keaton, he mentions that this is a film that really any leading man in the 1920s could have done. Nothing about the material particularly called out for Buster Keaton to appear in a screen version of it. Though I think you could make that same argument for Seven Chances, which was also based off a stage farce, and yet people seem to like Seven Chances a bit more than they like Battling Butler. But I think Battling Butler, as I mentioned earlier, it's fantastic. I think the way Buster adapted this and put his own personal stamp on it is absolutely to be commended. He took a genre he really didn't like, farce, and he added so much emotional heft to it. Like, there is a low-key simmering sense of dread that builds over the course of this film, not unlike Our Hospitality, where so much of the comedy in that film feeds off of the horror of Buster's situation, where he's trapped in a house with people who want to kill him and are only not doing so because of their Southern honor. The movie dangles forth the possibility that Alfred is going to get the absolute crap kicked out of him by the end of the film, and it's not exactly a laughing matter. We don't want to see Alfred get hurt. You know, he may be a rich twit, but he's a really nice, gentle guy at the heart of it. In his book, Keaton, The Silent Features Close Up, Daniel Mose talks about how Battling Butler is a really interesting evolution from The Navigator. In The Navigator, the Rollo Treadway character played by Keaton he is also a comical rich idiot. And he does become smarter over the course of the film. By the end, he's able to take care of himself. But there isn't the same emotional weight to his journey that you get in Battling Butler. You know, this is just a lot more emotionally profound. And by emotionally profound, just know I mean there's more weight to it, not necessarily that this is Shakespeare or Dostoevsky. Now we have Alfred sitting down to dinner. Initially, it looks very appealing, but as he has to train to box, it will soon all be replaced with prunes and crackers and milk. Buster also had to diet while making this film to stick to as accurate a boxer's lifestyle as possible. This sequence at the dinner table is the final part before the climax in the boxing ring. And it's almost kind of fitting when you think about it. It's a kind of last meal for Alfred, who feels like in the ring he may not make it. He may not survive to enjoy his marriage at all. This is a really interesting intertitle. Obviously, it's comic in its catalog of complaints Alfred has about his training, but there's also a dramatic aspect to it too, and I love the repetition of and the storm at the end. By the way, I haven't mentioned it yet, but the name Alabama Murderer is really cool. Literally, I don't have anything more profound to say than that. Sorry. All right, Tom Wilson is pacing the room, and then in comes Alfred. I love the detail with the horseshoe, and he's walking in like a man condemned. Great touch. Whenever people talk about the power of silent cinema, they tend to go for the big grand gestures like the Moloch scene in Metropolis or Lillian Gish on the ice and Way Down East or things like that. But I love how clear and expressive the pantomime is in this scene between the trainer and Alfred. How the trainer, you can just tell from his body language, he's like, hey, you're late, get dressed, or I guess undressed. And, there's no inner titles either. No need to explain anything. In fact, if you're a Keaton fan, you probably know this, but one of my favorite stories is that Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin had a little contest between them to see who could make a feature film with the least amount of inner titles. And I believe Charlie Chaplin won, though it was only by a small fraction. Keaton was a master at wordless storytelling. This part with the other two fighters in the ring is another great way the film continues to build suspense up until the final fight. And oh my god, it kills me in a sec they're about to cut to the boxer's face. It's like bloody and it looks pretty nasty for a film of this vintage. And of course, the trainer is not going to shy away from a mess that has been made of this man's face. I can almost hear what he's saying in my head. The pantomime is so clear. And Keaton's depiction of his mounting anxiety and dread over the fight is just wonderful. It's very, like anything with Keaton, it's very understated. He kind of just curls into himself a bit. He gets this look of sorrowful resignation on his face, but there's no like over the top quaking or shaking. And then we're about to get more bloody nasty scenes from the ring. Anytime I come back to watch Battling Butler, I often forget about those scenes, how dark they are. The guy even spits out a tooth, like, ugh. And again, the manager has to go into, or no, the trainer has to go into the gory details. Yeah, and I think everybody has a friend like that who just loves getting as morbid as possible with this sort of thing. And then it gets even worse because the valet is about to point out an ambulance outside with this gurney that almost resembles a coffin. And to no one's surprise, the valet has arranged everything. It's interesting to compare this film's pre boxing scene to that in Charlie Chaplin's City Lights. Of course, I'm talking about when the little tramp attempts to enter a boxing match in order to win money for the blind girl's operation. He tries finding a way to kind of weasel out of having to properly fight. At first, he colludes with his potential opponent, but then that guy has to run out of there because the cops are after him. And then another person comes in who's not willing to split 50-50 like he was going to do with the original guy. And he borrows a lucky rabbit's foot and a horseshoe from another fighter. And then that guy goes out into the ring, and all the while, Charlie is using the magical items, so to speak, until the fighter comes back and he's being carried out unconscious. So you do have some of the same fear of getting the crap kicked out of you, but it really doesn't have the same sense of realistic violence as here. Nobody really gets bloodied up in City Lights. And obviously, when you watch the actual boxing match in that film, it's more balletic than anything. The choreography is astonishing, but it's certainly not realistic. And that goes to show the difference in tone between a Keaton film and a Chaplin film. Chaplin's films exist in a slightly more heightened reality, a Dickensian reality. And that's not meant as a slam against him, mind you. I'm just simply pointing out the differences between the two directors stylistically. Anyway, oh my goodness, I keep talking over the important inner titles. So the Mountain Girl has just returned, and she has revealed in her very 1920s feathered outfit that the stakes have upped considerably for this fight. So her father and brother have betted just about all their money on the line on the hopes of Alfred winning. And so now he is not only in danger of losing his marriage, he is not only in danger of having his brains beaten out, but his in laws are about to be impoverished because they bet all their money on him winning. And as we know, and as the valet is certain, he is not going to win that fight. Or so we think. It turns out that Alfred will not have to die in the ring after all. I love this device with them opening the little window and looking outside. But yes, so the real Battling Butler gets to claim his glory in the ring. Alfred gets to save his neck. It's all good. Or at least at the end of the play, it was all good. As mentioned earlier, Keaton hated the play's ending. He felt it was boring. He felt it lacked excitement or even any kind of dramatic satisfaction. Especially in this film, Alfred has been such a suffering character this entire time. Just to give him an easy reprieve would not be satisfying. To keep that sort of ending in the context of this film, in the context of the way Keaton has been building the story, it would be a continued infantilization of the character. He would literally just be the same guy he was at the start, only now he's got a wife, and I guess he'll avoid boxing rings the rest of his life. Keaton's modified ending not only gives Alfred a heroic moment, or rather a moment to show he has changed as a character over the course of the film, but it also allows us to get some justice done to Battling Butler, who's been such a horrible person, quite frankly, over the course of the film, particularly towards his wife. Oh, and here's everybody's favorite suggestive inner title. But man, yeah, his entire body language, I mean, Battling Butler here, it's just so genuinely menacing. There's really nothing funny about it at all. And all the humor flies out the window in this scene. I mean, most of the humor has been very dark up to this point, but obviously it is humor. But what's interesting about this climax is that there really is nothing funny about the scene at all. It is genuinely upsetting to watch him corner Buster like this and start pummeling him. And the whole time, Alfred is just trying to de escalate the situation. He's just trying to talk Battling Butler out of it, and obviously that's not going to work, and he corners him around this room. And in a sense, this is almost a metaphor for how the whole film has worked, where Alfred is doing everything he can to avoid doing anything violent at all. And then here he tries to escape, comes face to face with his wife and valet. There literally is no escape. It's almost like this is divine retribution for his extended deception of his wife and her family in a weird way. But in this scene, his modus operandi is not going to work. You know, having the valet arrange everything, and right now Snitz is about to walk in and try to intervene on his boss's behalf. But this is actually ultimately what triggers the film's most shocking moment, and what may be the most shocking moment of Buster Keaton's entire filmography. Oh my god, even when the valet goes down, he realistically reacts the way an older man would to hitting the floor that hard. There's nothing comedic about it. And then right there is where he just gets absolutely pissed off. And if you were ever in doubt of how astonishing a dramatic actor Keaton could be, this scene is Exhibit A. This isn't like the moment in the frozen north where he snarls exaggeratedly at someone. This feels absolutely genuine. This fight is brutal. And a lot of people are a bit torn on this scene and whether or not it's an appropriate ending to the film. Not inappropriate in a moral sense, but they feel it's out of character for Buster to get so angry, to get this emotional. Personally, I think it's anything but inappropriate or out of character. I think this ending and this reaction fits this film perfectly. Alfred's rage is, I mean, yeah, it's dramatically appropriate and it suits the film's themes about masculinity in a way. Alfred is not naturally aggressive. He's not an abuser. He doesn't seek to dominate or hurt other people. And this is what makes Butler such a perfect foil. He's a warped embodiment of the masculine. His entire life is about dominating and bullying other people. He is everything Alfred isn't and shouldn't become. But Alfred, he only becomes aggressive like this when Butler lashes out against the people he cares about. It's not all of a sudden, oh, I'm getting mad and just being aggressive for no reason. He's doing it in defense of people he cares about. Though it is interesting how he does attempt to continue beating the crap out of Butler even after he's down and clearly unconscious. It's almost like Alfred is at the edge of becoming his own shadow in a Jungian sense, like letting the aggressiveness that's been dormant in him so long overtake him completely. But by the end of the film, obviously he's not going to become some swaggering macho bully or anything like that, but it does show he is someone who is able to take care of himself now. He is someone who can be assertive and not just picked on and pushed around. And what's interesting is this little spark of anger or frustration. You can find it in other later Keaton films as well. I mean, the end of College, where he races to rescue his girlfriend from Harold Goodwin, has some of the same energy as the ending of Battling Butler, where he's just absolutely furious. Or even Spite Marriage, during the final fight on the ship with the gangsters, you do see some of that quality. And I just find it so interesting juxtaposed against Buster's usual, very reserved, stoic on screen persona. I don't think it's inappropriate. I think it's just very, very interesting. But anyway, now it's the iconic last shot of Battling Butler. Alfred strolling all arm in arm with the mountain girl. He's partially dressed like the rich gentleman, partially dressed like the boxer. I suppose in a Jungian sense, you could say he has been he's achieved self-actualization. He is a wholer person by the end of this would-be farce. Anyway, that is the end of the commentary track. I apologize if there was a lot of rambling in this one. And let's not even get started on my weird random pauses, but that's just my mind buffering. I am so sorry. But anyway, this was for the Buster Keaton Blogathon hosted by Silentology. Definitely check out her blog to see what else is on the roster. She's been hosting it for about 11 years now. It is always a lot of fun. Highly recommend checking out both her stuff and what anybody else has posted. Anyway, this is Nitrate Glow. Thank you very much.